get started. Thank you. All right, so welcome everyone. This is our second technical assistance session this week. Thank you to those who attended yesterday, and happy to see some familiar faces in our attendee list. Today's session is going to be focused on a number of different compliance topics related to the ConnectALL deployment program. We're going to show an agenda in just a second. I will just briefly talk about some housekeeping items and then pass it to our speaker for today. I'll introduce in just a second. Today's session is being recorded. You should have heard an alert on your Zoom. The recording and slides, as with our previous technical assistance sessions, will be shared out to all of you on this call following the session, and will also be posted publicly on our website at broadband.ny.gov. Please keep an eye on the chat throughout the session. We'll be dropping some links to supplemental materials that are mentioned during the presentation in there. And we will make sure that any relevant links are also included in the follow-up materials. Please send questions during the session using the Zoom Q&A function. I already see a couple coming in, so thank you. That is the speech bubble icon at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions throughout the session or at any time via email to connectall@esd.ny.gov. Generally speaking, we are not answering questions live during these sessions. We are taking all questions and posting answers in writing to the ConnectALL website so that all applicants receive the answers at the same time. However, I will be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and if any questions come in that are just like quick hit clarifications, or, can you please repeat something you just said, something like that, we will try to address those in real time. So I'll be keeping an eye on that, but please do submit throughout the session. To go through our agenda, I will hand it over to Joanne Hovis, who's joining us from CTC Technology and Energy. And realizing I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Kat Lau. I'm a consultant with HRNA Advisors. We are supporting the ConnectALL office with the program management for the ConnectALL deployment program, and CTC is one of our partners also supporting the ConnectALL office. So we have some experts from CTC today who are going to be presenting on these different compliance topics, and will also be assisting us with answering your questions in writing following the session. So with that, I will hand it over to Joanne. Joanne, please feel free to give a more extended introduction as well on some of your background on these topics. I think that would be appreciated by our speakers, and then you can go through the agenda for today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Kat. And I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I'm going to take your nod as meaning yes, where all things technical are working well. So good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you, with the ConnectALL office, and with Kat for this session. I am from CTC Technology and Energy, and I have just to introduce myself, as Kat requested, have worked on the public sector side with regard to broadband strategy and planning since the advent of the commercial internet, and work extensively with many states right now as they have designed and executed their various funding programs, including the BEAD program. And I'm particularly honored to be part of the ConnectALL team as a subcontractor to HRNA. So what we're going to talk about today, as Kat mentioned, is a set of different requirements that are built into the BEAD program. And for applicants and potential awardees for BEAD, knowing that these requirements are out there is really critically important. These are going to be areas not only that will be important to preparing a compliant and successful application, but of course to reporting and compliance once you are the awardee, if indeed that happens. In addition, because of the requirements and what they impose, these are critical elements to understand as you build your grant strategy, build your business plan for the grant, and develop the financials and the economics of what your bid will look like. By the way, I'm joined here also on the line by my colleague, Ziggy Rifkin-Fish, who will step in as necessary on some of these issues if we need that. But here in front of you is the agenda. We'll talk about the Build America, Buy America, known as BABA requirements that were built into the statute by Congress as they've been interpreted by NTIA, the federal administration that's part of the Department of Commerce that is responsible for overseeing the states with this program. We'll talk about environmental and historic preservation requirements, a summary at a very high level. We'll talk about labor reporting, where we have extensive federal requirements and also extensive state requirements, tribal consent, a necessary element as well, and then a broad overview of what the reporting requirements for the program look like as well. What we're presenting here today is obviously in the form of a PowerPoint deck. It is a summary at an overview level of these requirements. Please, if you are an applicant or potential applicant for the BEAD program, it is essential to understand all of these at a detail level as well as at an overview level. The most valuable document that you have at your disposal is what is called the Initial Proposal Volume 2, which is the document that the ConnectALL office created as a means of complying with the federal requirement to propose how the state of New York would execute a grant program as part of the BEAD program. That Initial Proposal Volume 2, sometimes called IPV2, is available to you on the ConnectALL website, and it is the proposal that the ConnectALL office made and that the federal government accepted for how this program would be run. It is what we think of as the BEAD Bible. It is the document that you want to know best. And if you have any detailed questions about these and other elements, that document will answer some of them, although that should absolutely not stop you from posing the questions using the mechanism that Kat described a few minutes ago. But I just do want to reference that document because it is the ultimate authority on the commitments that the state of New York has made for how to execute this grant program. Okay, let's jump in on these topics. Could we have the next slide, please? So, here I'm sort of anticipating I anticipated some of what I was sharing a minute ago regarding the documents that are controlling with the Initial Proposal Volume 2 as a critical one. Here you have a list of other documents that are also very important. In particular, the first two prepared by NTIA, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and then guidance documents that have been provided by NTIA since the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which was released around 2 years ago. So there's been follow-up guidance. And then, of course, Initial Proposal Volume 2 and the program RFA for the office. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, and one more. All right, let's talk about Build America, Buy America. I think this is somewhat self-evident, but it's clear that Congress, in writing and passing the IIJA, which is the piece of legislation that funded BEAD, cared enormously about encouraging and incentivizing manufacture of key components for infrastructure projects in the United States. And Congress included a BABA requirement with regard to BEAD for a range of different kinds of products to create that incentive for manufacturers to either create the manufacturing capabilities here in the United States or to move certain manufacturing capabilities from overseas back to the United States, effectively onshoring those efforts. BABA is a mandatory element of the BEAD program, and it is not something that the state of New York or any other state can change or waive. It is a federal requirement as written by Congress and then interpreted by the agency. However, federal agencies are able to waive or partially waive BABA for certain programs based on certain kinds of circumstances. Can I have the next slide, please? So that opportunity to partially waive is something that NTIA has taken advantage of with regard to the BEAD program. It has issued a limited waiver, limited for BEAD, but only for certain elements. And the waiver has been extended by NTIA to certain things that are listed here, such as the non-optic glass inputs, the fiber optic connectors, the passive optical equipment, semiconductors, etc. And you have the list here, as well as in the resources that are cited at the bottom of the page here, where the waivers have been included. And for any BEAD awardee, you should be knowledgeable about what has been waived and what has not been. What has not been are certain kinds of construction materials, components of fiber optic cable, and certain electronics that must be produced in the United States. The process for that determination is based on self-certification by the manufacturers, and the manufacturers are in a position to then provide you as the applicant, or later as the grantee, with a letter certifying that you have committed to procure or have procured these materials from them, and that these materials, based on their self-certification, were produced domestically. There are, as an aside, a range of manufacturers who are doing exactly this. They have organized to do this, and they have indeed, as a result of the BABA requirements in the IIJA, onshored or reshored into the United States certain kinds of manufacturing in order to be compliant and in order to be able to access the BEAD awardee market, to be able to sell equipment to all of you as the potential awardees, equipment and other materials. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are the requirements for an applicant hoping to be a future grantee? There is a place in the pre-qualification application where you will note and certify that you will be compliant. You will need to consult with BABA self-certified manufacturers in order to ensure that they can provide you with materials that are BABA compliant for those relevant materials, and not to make purchase commitments until you are sure that they are self-certified and compliant. And then you will, as an awardee, report on this in your reporting to ConnectALL, including providing that certification letter that I mentioned a few minutes ago from the manufacturers, and further information on international sourcing of waived electronics. So for those items where the BABA requirements have been waived, providing information as necessary and as requested about what you have procured in that regard. Can I have the next slide, please? Let's move on to environmental and historic preservation. And let me start with a big picture on this, with apologies to those for whom this is old news. I think this is an important set of issues to raise because other federally funded broadband grant programs that have flowed through states have not always had the same kinds of requirements around the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA. Both of these things establish some pretty robust requirements for review and then compliance. And with respect to both of them, they are mandatory elements of compliance with the BEAD program as established by the federal government. One way to understand what NEPA and NHPA mean with regard to what we will be doing in executing BEAD program grants. For those of you that are grantees, is that you will be taking on certain efforts that are related to what federal agencies and states as who have been made equally responsible for this compliance as the federal government by NTIA. So states and NTIA are sharing this responsibility, and the responsibility is what they call stop, look, and listen. It's pretty intuitive from there what this means. It's really a consultation and consideration effort to try to pause, investigate, and then try to understand, is there impact that needs to be addressed before the networks can be built? That is what stop, look, and listen involves. I'll go into more detail on what that will entail in just a moment. But generally, that review, that analysis, and all the related consultations with relevant stakeholders has to be undertaken before a project can begin construction. And part of the reason it's important to start thinking about this now is because there's some information that has to be addressed in the application. But importantly, if you are likely to be an awardee, your timeline on beginning deployment is going to be dependent on your ability to move through this process in a way that is compliant. So it is a consideration that you should build into all of your strategic planning, your timeline, your business case, and so on. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so let's start with NEPA. NEPA is really this umbrella framework for all of the different environmental, historic, and cultural resource laws, all of the different elements of that kind of review. And what this NEPA review will do is provide an overall analysis about whether there's a potential significant impact of the project. It requires an early analysis and consideration of that. Requires the appropriate documentation in order to confirm what is necessary, and builds the environmental potential impact into a range of other impacts. It is an overall framework for compliance with all of these other elements. Can I have the next slide, please? So it is important to note that NEPA is not necessarily going to feel the same way in the deployment or play out the same way in the deployment of a broadband network as it would in the deployment of a bridge or a road or a highway or some kind of other significant infrastructure project. And this is because, as you all know, there is a lesser impact to the environment of deployment of broadband. In a fiber context, that might be placing fiber or other wireline infrastructure on a utility pole where the impact might be negligible, or even underground, where if it is to already disturbed roadway that has no potential considerations around human remains or other potential disturbances, the impact would be very minimal because of the small physical footprint of even an underground fiber deployment or wireline deployment relative to the enormous physical footprint of a road, a highway, or other kind of infrastructure project. So what might that mean? It might mean that the analysis with regard to NEPA concludes that there is an opportunity for the lowest level of review, the one that is going to be fastest, most efficient, and very likely for many broadband projects, which is categorical exclusion, which means that there is a determination made that because the broadband project will likely not have a significant effect on the environment, the entire project can be categorically excluded based on that analysis, based on that review and that determination, thus not requiring a higher level of review. The higher levels of review are, in the event that there is not a categorical exclusion, the next highest level would be an environmental assessment. This is when there is uncertainty about the significance of the potential impact, and there needs to be a more extensive analysis with fuller consideration of that potential impact, with the potential of finding no significant impact, a finding of no significant impact known as a FONSI. If this is the case, if there is a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact based on this much more extensive, potentially half-year to full-year analysis by the grantee, using the appropriate expert support and in consultation with the state and NTIA, the finding of a FONSI then means that there is no need for the highest level of review, which is an environmental impact statement or an EIS. An EIS is a much more significant effort. It is potentially going to take as long as 1 year to 2 years in some cases, although not in a broadband context. An EIS sometimes takes considerably longer than that. It's a very costly and a very extensive level of effort. And an EIS is necessary where a categorical exclusion is inappropriate because there was a finding that there would be or likely be a significant effect on the environment, and an environmental assessment is inappropriate because there is a finding that there would be a significant effect on the environment. So the lower levels of review found to be inappropriate, an EIS is then necessary to understand the impact on the environment and to make a decision about whether the project can proceed or not. It is going to be relatively infrequent that an EIS is necessary in a broadband context, and most broadband projects are likely to be considered to have been categorically excluded through a categorical exclusion. But these are the different layers, and this is some of the framework for understanding what is coming. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so let's talk about the categorical exclusions because they are going to be most significant. And what this really is that faster review element that understands that a more robust, extensive NEPA review process is not necessary because of the type of deployment that this represents, and that it is likely to have minimal environmental impact. Again, broadband fitting relatively comfortably in many, many cases into that category. So the process that will be required here is that the grantees will detail their projects and provide all of the appropriate information about how their project will be deployed and what that will actually look like with regard to the deployment. A categorical exclusion would then be identified. All of the different categories of CADX would be considered to see which one might be appropriate, and assuming that there are no circumstances that are extraordinary outside of that CADX that would create a need for a more detailed environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, the CADX applies and the project is then confirmed from a NEPA standpoint and can move to deployment. Can I have the next slide, please? That's a broad overview of NEPA, and it is something that we anticipate that CADX will be applicable in many, many cases, although not necessarily all. But the second larger category and the overview I want to offer here is with regard to the National Historic Preservation Act. As I said earlier, this is the second big part of environmental and historical preservation compliance. And Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires a review of every project this has been applied to BEAD, so every BEAD-funded project will require this, which will include an evaluation of the historically and culturally protected and sensitive areas that might be impacted by the project. As part of that, the expert state entities in this area, who are the state historical preservation offices and the tribal historical preservation offices, must be consulted so that they can be part of this consideration, identify concerns as necessary, and help to understand if there might be areas that could be adversely impacted. It's important to note that even if your project is awarded a CADX under NEPA, that does not mean that you don't have to do Section 106 NHPA analysis. These are two different processes. They have some relationship to each other, but they are both mandatory, and getting through one does not exempt a project from the other. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. Section 106 is famously complicated and extensive. I will just share that some of the federal government graphics designed to show the processes and the work and decision flows are some of the most astonishingly complicated I have seen in the entirety of my career. But fortunately, there has been significant effort on NTIA's part to try to build a streamlined and efficient review that aligns with the goals of the BEAD program to get broadband deployed as quickly as is reasonably possible to meet the universal service goals of BEAD. And the streamlined review, in brief, effectively has three key questions that need to be answered. The first is, has the area where there might be an effect already been surveyed for these purposes? Second, are there known historic or other locations in that area, including lands associated with tribes? And third, what is the construction methodology, and does it align with what has already been disturbed in that area, such that the chances are very low that there might be intact historic artifacts in that area? So these questions really trying to get at, have there already been efforts in the past, analysis done in the past, construction done in the past that suggests that we're not really going to find very much this time around? And if that is the case, then there may be expedited review under the new streamlined review that NTIA has developed and had approved within the federal government. That new streamlined review, by the way, is known as the program comment. That's just federal jargon for this new and expedited streamlined way of getting through Section 106 analysis. In the event that there are potentially sensitive sites, then there is a consideration of GIS analysis of the known sites where it is known that there are already historic artifacts, including human remains, tribal lands, historic districts, etc., and what is necessary to identify those sensitive sites. Can I have the next slide, please? NTIA, by the way, has created and is updating and improving on a resource that is available on the NTIA website, and that will continue, I think, to be developed and made as useful as possible for understanding and identifying where there are already data or information available about these things. And as you can see from the graphic, which is a screenshot from the NTIA tool, there is an effort to accumulate as much and aggregate as much information as possible about existing resources, existing environmental considerations, existing historic locations, other kinds of information, so as to become not quite, but hopefully close to a one-stop shop for understanding the full range of information. That access to this information and use of this information is not sufficient. Consultation is still going to be necessary to talk to that state historic preservation office, the tribal historic preservation office, and so on, to try to identify, is there anything else out there that has not yet been identified, to try to overturn every rock possible to make sure that all considerations have been taken into account. But the goal of this resource is to provide as much information in a single place as possible for efficiency and convenience purposes. Can I have the next slide, please? So what do you have to think about in preparing your application? Well, a starting point is going to be in the pre-qualification, there is a requirement to certify past compliance or to explain any past violations or non-compliance. In the application itself, there will be a request for details on past experience with all of these different processes. And then once the award is made, there will be coordination and collaboration with ConnectALL to make sure that the required reviews are completed, providing the information as necessary, obtaining the permits and approvals, including the NEPA and NHPA requirements. So some of this pre-application submission and some of it post-award. Can I have the next slide, please? Let me move on to labor, recognizing that NEPA and NHPA are enormous areas, and just with the qualification that what we have shared today is a high-level overview of what this will require. I hope that it was relatively simple and gives you a big picture on the necessary requirements. There will obviously be more detail, but as I said, in both cases, there are expedited ways to get through this process through data and consultation, assuming relatively minimal or no impact whatsoever. Okay, on the labor front, yeah, as is required by New York's Wired Broadband Act, all projects that are funded under BEAD in New York will be subject to prevailing wage requirements. And certification and provision of details regarding wages paid will be mandatory requirements for all grantees. In addition, for projects that exceed $5 million in total anticipated cost, there are additional requirements, and this is federal, for certifying that the project will use a unionized workforce or include a project labor agreement or provide a project workforce continuity plan. And we'll talk more about what this means in a moment. So the prevailing wage requirements, universal for all projects, the union project labor agreement, project workforce continuity plan, those are only for projects in excess of $5 million. Can I have the next slide, please? A project workforce continuity plan is something that grantees may provide as an alternative to certifying that they have a unionized workforce or a project labor agreement or a project labor agreement. They can provide a plan in which they detail in a way that is acceptable both to state and federal entities overseeing these grants, that the project has ready access to a sufficient supply of the appropriately skilled and unskilled labor to ensure that this is done throughout the life of the project. And what you see here are some of the descriptions of the elements that have to be discussed and described in the project workforce continuity plan, including discussion of training and certifications, apprenticeships or labor management partnership training programs, and partnerships with other entities for purposes of training skills, preparedness, and so on. The plan also has to address the steps that have been taken by the grantee to minimize the risk to the project of labor disputes or disruptions. And these are federal requirements. As you can see there, the source is the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the BEAD program that was released by NTIA. And if you're looking for more information on this, there is the citation. It's pages 91 to 92. This whole deck, by the way, has those citations so that you are able to go and get more information about each element. But this is the overall big picture of a project workforce continuity plan, which again is an alternative option to certifying either a unionized workforce or a project labor agreement in place. Can I have the next slide, please? More elements of the continuity plan is the steps the grantee has taken around a safe and healthy workplace, again, with an eye toward reducing delays and other costs associated with the alternative to a safe and healthy workplace, including descriptions of safety training, certification licenses, and so on. And then information about subcontracted entities. That would mean the contractors working with you, contractors and subcontractors working with you on the grants under your grant agreement. And then the steps taken to ensure that all workers on the project are getting wages and benefits sufficient to secure an appropriately skilled workforce in your local or regional labor market. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what is the summary of the requirements? In the pre-qualification application, there will be two things that you have to provide. Item number one, as you see on this slide, is a certification with past compliance or details of non-compliance. Item number two in the pre-qualification application is details on wage and overtime payment practices and on non-unionized roles. In the application itself, there will be a need to provide details about hiring practices, project labor agreements, and all of the other items noted here that are relevant to labor practices by the entity applying for funds. And then the necessary labor certification. Item number four, the labor certifications that were described on the previous slides, as well as reports on the jobs created and retained for each project. And those items number 4 and 5 are going to be post-award, not in the application materials. So 1 through 3 are part of the applications, both the pre-qualification and the project area applications. 4 and 5 for awardees under ConnectALL's BEAD program post-award. Can I have the next slide, please? Let's move on to tribal consent. And what this is a requirement that was included in the BEAD law and the BEAD rules promulgated by NTIA. And you can see the way that the state of New York proposes to implement this requirement on page 61 of the initial proposal, volume 2. And what this is really is that NTIA has said that states may not fund a grant for broadband on tribal lands or a federally recognized tribe if there is not the consent of tribal leadership effectively. And what that means is that there is a need for the state to collect from its applicants and awardees the relevant information in order to be able to demonstrate to NTIA that it has complied with this and that the tribal nation has approved the proposed awardee for any deployment on tribal lands. ConnectALL has built this into its BEAD program by providing points in evaluation for applicants that can demonstrate right at the beginning of this process in submitting their applications that they have support from tribal nations for their specific application. But even for an applicant that is not able to provide that in their application, prior to their formal award of a BEAD grant from ConnectALL, they will be required to secure the consent of the tribal nation in writing and provide it to the state for that then to be provided to the federal government. So two grantee requirements, really. The first one is in the application itself, provide documentation of tribal nation support, for which you can win up to 10 points in the scoring. And then prior to the grant award, secure that tribal consent. Can I have the next page, please? All right, let's talk about a broad overview of grantee reporting requirements post-award. And as you can see on the slide, some extensive federal requirements of reporting. Grantees will report to ConnectALL, which obviously is the designated and eligible entity for the state of New York, and in return reports on behalf of the state of New York to the federal government about progress, compliance, and so on. So at least semi-annually throughout the timeline of the grant, all grantees will have to report a very specific set of data to ConnectALL regarding the funds, and how they have been used and what the progress is in design, engineering, permitting, deployment, and so on. These reports then become the basis of ConnectALL's reporting up to NTIA, representing the federal government. There may also be additional reporting requirements that materialize over time because the federal government is iterating on this to some degree, and there may be other needs for additional information. There may also be a need for greater frequency of reporting, but the baseline is the semi-annual. Can I have the next slide, please? This is some of the range of reporting categories that will be required. And rather than design a dozen different slides with extensive lists of different kinds of data, we have provided this overview because we felt it's more useful for understanding at this stage of the process. If you would like to understand in greater detail the necessary elements of this and some of the detailed items that will be required, you have the sources down at the bottom of the slide there from which all of this is derived. And these are the documents that govern what ConnectALL is required by the federal government to collect in terms of data and then aggregate and report up to the federal government. You can see the range of different categories here, ranging from describing how the project is proceeding and the locations and geography where progress has been made, construction has happened, etc., to the services delivered, to the pricing offered and the number of subscribers that have applied for and have been delivered service, to extensive GIS data and financial reporting associated with both expenditures and revenues, to contracts and jobs and elements of that, from the types of contracts to the types of contract mentors who are supporting your project, to the number of jobs and the certifications on the labor side that we talked about just a few minutes ago, to confirmation of compliance with BABA and detail regarding BABA compliance and purchases of non-BABA compliant equipment that has been waived by NTIA, as we discussed at the beginning of this session. And the next slide, please. Let me now turn this back over to Kat with thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for taking us through so much dense and complicated content. I think having a simpler summary like this is so useful as a reference. As a reminder for everyone, these slides are going to be emailed to you and also posted on the ConnectALL website. So especially for the purposes of investigating those more detailed and more authoritative documents, please do take advantage of the fact that all of those sources are hyperlinked throughout the slides, so that you can take a look at the direct from the horse's mouth information from NTIA and the other agencies involved here. So we will provide materials, and thank you to my colleagues at CTC for preparing them. So for now, I think I've seen a handful of questions come through the Q&A. Thank you to folks who have submitted them. I see one quick one that I will clarify right now, and otherwise we will take these questions in and release answers in writing, as I was saying at the top of the session. So the one quick question I will clarify right now is just, are all technology types being considered currently? At this time, ConnectALL's project area applications or the request for applications has two technology categories. So there are what we call priority broadband projects, which are end-to-end fiber optic. And then there are what we call reliable broadband projects, which include other technologies that meet the NTIA standard for reliable broadband service. Those include cable, hybrid, fiber coax, licensed fixed wireless. The actual exact definitions of all of it are in the RFA. But those are the two technology categories in this request for applications. At this time, we are not accepting applications for what NTIA calls alternative technologies. That includes unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite technologies. ConnectALL may choose to release an additional request for applications at a later point for those technologies, but those are not currently part of this request for applications. So want to clarify that. Otherwise, the questions that I see in the Q&A are questions requesting additional detail on the individual compliance items that we talked about, BABA and NEPA. So we will follow up with definitive answers on those in writing for all applicants' reference. We are almost to the top of the hour, so we can leave this session open for another couple minutes for anyone who wants to submit questions through the Q&A module. Also, as a reminder, as you can see on this screen, at any time you can submit questions via email to us at connectalldeployment@esd.ny.gov. All of those questions go to the same place, whether you submit it through the webinar here or through email. We will be taking all of those in and releasing an updated batch of Q&A as soon as possible. We do have sort of a rolling cadence for these questions. So we have, I believe, some answers to older questions coming out pretty soon, and then hoping to be able to address all questions submitted through these webinars sometime next week. So as we leave this open for any additional questions, I'll also just remind everyone of the office hours sessions that ConnectALL has scheduled. So these have gone out over email, but are also listed on the ConnectALL website. We have office hours sessions for applicants scheduled for Tuesday, January 28th and Tuesday, February 4th for an hour each. those are going to be a little more interactive than these webinar sessions. I know it's always a little disheartening for people to join these webinars, and at the very top, we say we won't answer questions live. In the office hour sessions, we will be able to help do some more live back and forth with any technical issues you may be having with the CFA portal, any clarification questions on RFA requirements or templates. We'll be able to have a little bit more of a back and forth. Those sessions will also be recorded and posted to the website so that, again, all applicants have access to the same information. But that is an opportunity to get more real-time support as you're finalizing your application as we get closer to the deadline of February 7th. So with all of that, I have not seen additional questions coming through as I've been speaking for these last couple of minutes. So I think we'll go ahead and close out the session, but I want to just say thank you again to Joanne and Ziggy from CTC for preparing these materials and providing an excellent overview of the requirements. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's been great to see so many different entities represented, so many different organizations represented in our technical assistance sessions this week. We hope these have been helpful resources, and hopefully that the recordings and slides can be consulted on an ongoing basis as you continue to work on your applications. So with that, we will close. Please remember that email address. You can always submit questions and ask for help. Also, if there are additional topics that you would like to see covered in a technical assistance session, you can submit that feedback as well through that email, and we'll take that into consideration and possibly schedule some additional sessions. But yeah, with that, I will go ahead and close. Thank you again to everyone who joined and our presenters, and have a great rest of the afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.